Hi everyone, let's talk about vacation schemes. So this is a very fundamental part of your law school journey, and I would say it's probably the hardest part. And there's honestly so much to talk about that I've made this into a 4-part series. So today I'll be talking about the very initial stages, which is writing the application, as well as doing follow-up tests such as the Watson-Glaser test. In the next part, I'll be talking about my experience with assessment days and how they are like. And then in the third part, I'll be talking about mistakes I made and what I learned from them. And lastly, I think also most importantly, I'll be sharing about the highs and lows of VacSchemes and how do we cope with them. So the reason why I wanted to do this series was because I felt like there wasn't much resources available online when I was preparing for my vacation schemes, and I thought that if I could share about my experiences and mistakes that I made, this could help someone out there. So that's why I've decided to make this video. I really want this series to be helpful for you guys. So any resources that I have, they will be in the description box below. Let's start off with what are vacation schemes. Vacation schemes are like a 3 to 4 week legal internship in the UK, and during this time you can shadow lawyers, you can learn more about the firm and see whether the law firm is a good fit for you. So one of the reasons why vacation schemes are important is because at the end of your vacation scheme, most firms will offer a training contract interview, and if you manage to pass this interview, the firm will offer you a training contract. And you might be wondering, what is a training contract? This is basically a 2-year qualifying work experience that you will need in order to qualify as a solicitor in the UK. I would say vacation schemes are like a stepping stone to getting your training contract. But it's not to say that if you don't have any vacation schemes, you can't get a training contract, because you still can. Now let's talk about organisation. I think when vacation scheme comes along, there are like so many firms that you apply to and so many deadlines to keep track of. It's always good to have a system where you organize everything. So for me, I have a folder on applications, and because I'm a Singapore international student as well, and I also wish to apply to Singapore law firms, I have 2 separate folders. So one is for UK vacation schemes and another one is for Singapore legal internships. So under my UK vacation schemes folder, I will create subfolders for the different firms that I'm interested in. There are a few ways to determine which firms you are interested in. You could look at each firm's specialisation. For example, if you're interested in intellectual property, you might look at a firm who is doing great in that. For me, I was mainly looking at the Magic Circle firms, so I think that is also another way if you don't really know what specialisation you're very keen on doing. And I think it's very normal to not know which specialisation you want to do. I mean, after all, you're only in your 2nd year of law school, and we really haven't been exposed to so many different areas of law to know what we are interested in. On the practical side, we also have to look at deadlines. Some firms have really early deadlines, and I think because of the timing or something, it was just not at a great time for me, and I couldn't submit those applications. Therefore, a lot of the firms with the earlier deadlines, I did not apply to them. I think it's also a good idea to compile a list of which deadlines are due when and put it in your calendar. Some things to take note of when you're looking at application questions is, first of all, what is the question? A lot of firms have quite similar questions, but some of them might be more unique than others. I would say if you need to narrow down more firms, look at the questions that you like or you're comfortable with, and those that you might not be so comfortable with, you could strike them out. And number 2 is to look at word count. Most firms do have a character count limit, whereas some do not. If the character count is bigger, that means you have to write more words. That also means you need to spend more time on them. And let's be real, as a law student, we have to juggle our assignments, revision. We honestly don't have that much time. So it's a very practical consideration, which is that if the word count is way too high and I know that I don't have time to finish writing it by the deadline, I just wouldn't go for the firm. So once we've organized all of our questions, it makes it easier for us to go and start typing out our answers. So now let's move on to how do we answer and tackle these questions. Different law firms are looking for different things, so the questions may vary, but usually you'll see these big two questions. So the first question is, why do you want to become a solicitor, right? And the second question is, why this law firm particularly? So these are the two big questions that you almost always have to tackle. So it's good to have a very clear idea of why do you want to become a solicitor and why you're going for that firm. I think the best way to share about my structure is to use an example. So maybe we could use the example of why this law firm. So if the question is asking you about why do you want to apply to this law firm, I would always begin by having a thesis statement. You answer and you address the question very directly, and it should be short, succinct, and really to the point. So for example, I would say, my motivation for applying to this law firm is because of its global network. Short, sweet, answers the question. Following the thesis statement, I would like to give some evidence as to where did I get this information from. If you do a little bit of research, you'll be able to see where the law firm is operating, perhaps across many jurisdictions, many continents. This part of the structure would help to let the assessor know that you've really done your research and that you have an interest in the firm. I think that what's best is if you find something that's very unique, something that's not superficial or like very easy to find. I'm not sure how to explain this, but for example, some firms have initiatives, and these initiatives perhaps help the firm to become a more global firm and help its collaboration with other offices. And if you use this initiative as an example in your essay, I think it will send a very strong signal to the assessor that, I've done my homework, I know what I'm talking about, and I'm really keen to find out more about the firm. The next part of the structure is to always link it to yourself. I know this sounds very narcissistic, but you have to come into the picture. You have to show what are your own experiences that help to bring out a certain skill or a certain trait that you have which aligns you with the firm. And this is really important because when you're writing an application, you don't just want to be kissing ass and telling the firm how good they are, because at the end of the day, the firm wants to know how good you are. So I would say that almost in every paragraph that I write, I want to link it to something about myself and to show that my traits and my values align with the firm. At the beginning, this was really awkward and very hard to do because we're not used to talking about our strengths, but you just have to get comfortable with it because it's something that's really important in your application. When you're talking about yourself and your own experience, you want to use the STAR structure. So that's STAR. S stands for situation, so you want to describe what is the situation. T stands for task. What was the task that you had to complete? And then A stands for action. What did you do, right? And R stands for result. This is like a foolproof way of making sure that when you are sharing about your experience, you don't go off the rails and you talk about something that's completely unnecessary or irrelevant. You want to stick to the STAR structure so that you are straight to the point, succinct, and really concise. So coming back to the example that I was giving, so why do you want to work with a firm? If I were to link my own experience, I would talk about a time in which I collaborated with some of my teammates on a project. By showing that you've collaborated well on a certain task, it shows that you have the collaboration skills. So once you've shared about your personal experience, the last step is to link it to your thesis statement. How does your value and your trait link to answering the question? So in this example, perhaps I would say something like, as a team player, I'm able to collaborate in cross-border teams and to close multi-jurisdictional deals. And therefore, I wish to contribute to the collegiate culture and support the global network at X law firm. I'm just reading from my application, but this is mainly my structure when I am writing application questions. So another thing to take note of, other than having a good structure, is to look at the number of words that is required for each question. If a question requires 200 words, that means you would need to write 2 paragraphs of 2 separate points to answer the question. So it might seem very difficult to squeeze what I've just said, the entire structure, into 100 words, but it's definitely doable. The important part about writing an application is to check, and throughout the process really cut down words as much as you can. The first draft that you have, it's definitely going to exceed the word limit. I usually exceed about twice the word count, and I have to just cut from that. So you really have to look at what are the 2 most important skills or 2 most important points that you would like to tell the firm. And honestly, writing out the answer is the easy part. Cutting it down, it's the hardest part, because sometimes you just don't know how to choose between like 3 good points when you can only give 2 and the word count won't allow for more. And honestly, I'm still figuring that out myself. Let's say I have a point and it's supported by a very irrelevant example that doesn't seem to link very well with the point. That might be a point that I would eradicate, and I would consider prioritizing another point instead. Another tip would be to quantify. What I'm talking about is, remember the STAR technique, STAR, R being the result. When you share about the result or the outcome of what you have done in your task, it would be great if you could put a number to it, put a percentage to it. For example, like I helped to increase my social media following by 200% or by 300%. This would really help the firms see what is the extent of the result that you have achieved. So now I'm going to share more about what are the experiences that I have used in my own application to really bring out the values and skills that I have. So the HR recruiters from many firms always say that it doesn't matter how small or big your experiences are. It honestly doesn't have to be a legal internship, but if you have, you can write it in as well. But most importantly, it's how you show the skill that you have learned. So you have to create that very strong link between what is the experience that you have done and what is the outcome, what is the skill that you have shown. For me, I used examples such as my past legal internship. Don't just name drop, like it could be a very big firm, and if you don't have a good explanation about the task that you did or like how you went about doing it, it would be pretty pointless. So once again, stick to the STAR technique. Say something about what did you do exactly, specifically. For example, did you have to help draft a contract, proofread advisory letters? And then from there, what does it show? You have to be meticulous when proofreading letters. It shows that you have attention to detail. It's very important to show what is the skill that you've learned. And also, don't blatantly write in your application, from this experience, I have gained this skill, because it might be a bit too robotic. Let your experience speak for itself, but phrase it in a way such that anyone reading it would know that you have really shown this skill by going through this experience. Another experience that I used was my extracurriculars. Some examples of the extracurriculars that I did was I was the president of the Singapore Society at UCL. I also talked about my YouTube channel sometimes, which I was very amazed that some recruiters actually cared about it. And I also talked about me being on a subcommittee in a organization called the Young Women's Leadership Connection in Singapore. I really used these extracurriculars to showcase some of the skills that you won't really see when you are doing, for example, your internship. So some skills would be like, leadership skills, teamwork, being flexible, able to cope with change, and probably other skills like creativity. And the other category of experiences I used is competitions. This is something that you may or may not include depending on whether you participate in them. So in my first year, I joined the junior negotiation competition, and I partnered up with my friend Timothy. We managed to come up as semi-finalists. I learned really practical skills about how to negotiate with, say, another council and how to reach a strategic compromise. So I think this ties really well with working in corporate law in general, because in certain departments, for example, mergers and acquisitions, negotiation is kind of like a big deal and it's kind of an important skill that you need to have. So I think this was a really useful experience for me, and I would advise, if you are a first year looking to gain some experience, negotiation competitions are the way to go. And another competition I did was the senior moot competition, and I did this in my second year. I was still in the midst of the competition as I was writing the application, so I didn't put it in, but it's also a good experience to put in if you have, especially let's say if you've won awards, you've come out as the top semi-finalist or finalist. So now we have 3 categories: legal internships, extracurriculars, and competitions. Last category is to look at deals that the firms have worked on. So I talked about a little bit about this just now, but to elaborate a little bit more, firms do a lot of deals, and some of them are big deals. Deals that make it to the headlines or they receive awards for it. I think it's a very good way to show that you have researched into a firm by narrowing down into one particular deal that really interests you, and to show that you understood and you have read the deal in brief. Usually the firms will post it on their website, so you can find it under the news section. Sometimes they don't provide a lot of information on deal, or it's a little bit hard to find the specifics about it. But I think you make do with what you have. You read up on the brief, the summary that is provided. So I think when you're discussing about a deal, you want to show exactly why you're interested in it. So perhaps it could be a very groundbreaking deal, the first of its kind. But once again, it's very important that when you're talking about deals, you always link back to the thesis statement. You don't want to get caught up in just talking about the deal and rambling on. The deal is kind of like an example that you use to support your thesis statement. So the next part that I want to talk about is the skills that you want to really show when you are answering these questions. I usually don't repeat a skill in my entire application. So even though there might be 3 different questions, I could be talking about different skills, but they never overlap because you don't want to waste your words talking about the same thing using the same experience, right? You want to show diversity, you want to show as much as you can in the limited words that are given. So I know this sounds a little bit mechanic, but what I do is for each question, I would write down a draft of how I would answer it and what skill is linked to it, and I would look at the entire application and make sure that the skills do not overlap. And I use different experiences and examples to support them. And if you're wondering where do I find all these skills to talk about, I think the best place is honestly Google, because Google, if you just do a quick Google about like soft skills that are important to working, you will find a long list of important skills that you should be looking at. But definitely be honest, be genuine. Don't pick out skills that you think are not your strengths. Look at what you're good at, look at your experiences, and just find those skills that best describe them. I'll be compiling a list of questions that I've seen before in application questions in a Google Docs, and so you can check it out in the link below. Okay, and with that, we've concluded the first part, which is talking about writing the applications. I hope this was helpful. And now we're going to talk about doing the follow-up tests. And one of the most popular one is the Watson-Glaser test. So the Watson-Glaser test is a super popular test that is used by a lot of law firms because it tests your critical thinking ability skills. What usually happens is that they will give you chunks of information or paragraphs to read. It's usually not very long, it's probably like 2 paragraphs at most. And within a very short amount of time, you have to read it, digest it, and answer some questions. So in the Watson-Glaser test, there are 5 skills that they're looking at. So a Watson-Glaser test is about 40 questions, and you have to complete it within usually 30 minutes or 40 minutes. It's basically not a lot of time. You have perhaps like exactly a minute or less to do a single question. The most important point to take note for Watson-Glaser is your time. You want to be fast. You want to be keeping track of your time and to move on if the clock is ticking. And the second point that's also very important is to practice. I think for Watson-Glaser, there's no way around it, and hearing from a lot of HR recruiters, the number one advice is to just practice, practice, practice. There are a lot of free practices that are available online, so do go and use them. There are also some packages that are available that they do charge a fee, and I think that's really dependent on you if you want to spend that amount. Personally, for me, I've only used free practices so far, and I have managed to do alright for most of my Watson-Glaser tests. So what I've done is actually I've made a cheat sheet for the Watson-Glaser test. It's not really a cheat sheet. but it's basically a document where I put down the instructions for each section. So for example, the first section is identifying assumptions. So I'll copy and paste the instructions onto this folder just to make sure that I'm crystal clear about what this section is looking for. One thing to note that when you're practicing is to not just go through the questions, but to also, more importantly, look at the answers and how the answers are derived. Because it doesn't matter if you do 100 practices and you don't learn from any of them. It's more important if you do a few practices and you really learn from your mistakes. Like I mentioned, the Watson-Glaser test is broken down into 5 separate sections. I'm not going to do a crash course on how to do a Watson-Glaser test, but the resources are for you up there. I think what's very important is to read each section and its instructions to know exactly what they're looking out for. So some sections might overlap with one another and they sometimes become very similar and you might get confused. 2 sections in the Watson-Glaser test are very similar. So the first section is the deduction section and the other one is the interpreting information section. So for the deduction section, the conclusion must follow exactly from the statement. You cannot use general knowledge, it has to come exactly from the information provided. Whereas the section for interpreting information, the conclusion does not have to follow exactly, it just has to follow beyond a reasonable doubt. So as you can see, there's a slight difference between the different sections that you have to be very careful of and to think about it when you are answering the questions. Something else that I do is after every practice, if the answer scheme provides something that's like a tip or a good advice, I would copy and paste it into this document and make sure that it's all compiled neatly so that when I revise before a Watson-Glaser, I have a quick look through this document and I'm aware of all of the things that I should be looking out for. So with that, I have concluded 2 parts of the first episode, which is talking about writing an application as well as how to do Watson-Glaser test. And I really hope that this was helpful for you guys, and do leave in the comments below if you have any questions at all, or is there anything that you'd like to see in the coming episodes. If not, stay tuned for the next episode, which will be about assessment days.